I mean, I know from the numbers they're doing it with debt, but this does not strike me as terribly sustainable.
No. And the debts, they're getting tapped out too. Look at delinquency rates going up. They can't, banks are, they're looking at the interest rates. It's like, I can't pay 25% interest, even though I may need to survive. It's just a little too much for my liking. And then bank credit offerings are becoming constricted because they understand the risk profile of what it would be to lend money out to people making this much income at these interest rates. It's a shit show. And then to make matters all the more worse, even if you were to take the government's statistics at face value, they're still lying to the public, particularly the Biden administration. Oh, we've solved inflation's lower. You solved the rate of inflation, which is still building on a higher base that built up from 2020. Right. And so the index is still up quite high if we are to take your numbers at face value, which we're not, because they're not true at all. But even if you were to appease the government and what they're trying to tell you, it's like, it's still not as good as you're making it out to be.
Yeah, well, like, if there's a junkie who shows up and siphons off a gallon of gas every night out of your fuel tank, okay? And then, you're like, hey, what are you doing? He's like, okay, tell you what, I'll just take a half gallon. You're like, you know what? Yeah, that'll work. Things are a lot better now. I mean, that's where we are. Like, it's not like prices are ever going to go down. They will never go down again, of course, as long as the Fed exists, because the reason, that's like the Fed's go-to excuse for why it counterfeits money is that, it claims that deflation is always bad. So, right, those prices are never, ever coming back. The best you could say about Biden is that it's not getting as bad as it was a couple of years ago. But of course, if you look at the inflation rate, even now, it's about 3.5, 3.7, even if we take the official numbers. I had a video the other day that inflation expectations, okay, so what Americans think inflation is going to do in the next 10 years are currently at 5.3%. That is 10 years. And it's an article of faith that consumer expectations are one of the most accurate reads of future inflation. They're extremely accurate. The Fed watches them like a hawk because they know they're accurate. And in fact, if we go back to the worst of Biden inflation, right, the absolute worst, when actual official inflation was, it was actually over 10% because they do this funny thing with housing with delays. Anyway, official inflation was over 10%, and it was 9.9. And expectations at that time, okay, Americans thought that inflation was going to be about 4%. Now they're saying 5.3. So in other words, if you actually talk to Americans, who are the gold standard for predicting inflation, why? Because they raise prices. They are the inflation. They're the ones who, process the inflation. It runs through them. Inflation actually looks like it's saved up to take another jump. And just going by the expectation numbers, that could be bigger than the last bout that we just had with Joe Biden. And that would, by the way, be the exact pattern of the 1970s, right? So the 1970s, we had two, looked like a camel's back, right? So you had one inflation, it got into double digits. Then it came back down for a little bit. The Fed declared victory, just like they are now. And then it jumped again. We're almost month to month on track for that, which is pretty astounding. What's concerning for me is that in the 1970s, it ended because we had a Fed chair, Paul Volcker, who cranked rates up so hard. We had the biggest recession since the Great Depression. Finally, it broke the back of inflation. But the problem is, he was appointed by Jimmy Carter, who's obviously a very inflationist guy. I don't think Jimmy Carter knew what he was getting in Paul Volcker. I think he was surprised. Moreover, by crashing the economy so hard, of course, Jimmy Carter lost the election, right? Because people blamed him for not only the inflation, but the recession, meaning that Washington's not going to be that dumb again. They're not going to put somebody in there who is hard money, who's going to lose the president who appointed him the election again. So that's my concern, is that if we get into that kind of 1970s scenario where inflation takes off again, I don't see Jerome Powell having it in him to hike rates the way that Volcker did. I mean,
do you still have your Bitcoin on an exchange? Don't hold your Bitcoin on an exchange. Take it into self-custody. If you're looking for an easy way to do that, we have the BitKey. BitKey is Bitcoin made easy to use and hard to lose. Take the first step, get your Bitcoin off the exchange. Check out the link in the show notes. That'll get you 20% off your BitKey, or use the code TFTC20.
Current rates are like 5.25. Volcker got them up to like 16, 18, 19%. We had like 20% on mortgages. I mean, it was much, much more than Jerome Powell has ever thought about doing. So that's my concern, is that if we get into that place again, we may not be able to come out of it. Rather, Washington may just ride it off the cliff, because the alternative is that they fix it and lose their jobs. And no politician is going to take that deal.
No, they're not coming to save you. So you have to save yourself. This is something that it seems like many more people are waking up to, whether that's individual countries fading treasuries in favor of gold, or companies. We've seen a big trend over the last 6 months, particularly of individual companies that are publicly traded and even privately held companies following the likes of MicroStrategy and putting Bitcoin on their balance sheets as a treasury asset. And I think that is something that if you're listening, I'm sure you already know this because it's a Bitcoin podcast, but with the fact in mind that they're not coming to save you due to these circumstances in the history that you just explained, you got to save yourself. Like if you're running a company, if you're an individual, you have to get sound money on your balance sheet, whether it's your corporate balance sheet or your personal balance sheet. That is the only way we're going to manufacture a soft landing, in my opinion, is by winning hearts and minds. And I think convincing them that Bitcoin is the way out.
Well, and it's a moral imperative. I mean, if you run a company, you have a responsibility for your people. I run a business, you run a business. You come to look at your employees like family. And, if you want your business to survive, you have to hold some of your assets, some of the treasury assets, in something that's actually hard. And, obviously, I mean, Bitcoin compared to gold, I would put the odds, if we have a collapse, the odds that we flip to gold versus the odds that we flip to Bitcoin, I think obviously, the end game is Bitcoin. Gold has managed to do that many times in the past, but it's also failed over and over because it's got the fundamental physical flaw. It's vulnerable to government seizure. I would argue that, anybody who runs a company actually has a responsibility to put some of those assets in Bitcoin.
Yeah. Yeah, we're seeing it too here at 1031. It's in our portfolio companies. They're starting to bring credit products to market that blend traditional credit with Bitcoin, dual collateralizing with assets like commercial real estate and Bitcoin.